Morning, everybody. Welcome to this session on and this webinar on why tackling tenancy fraud matters, presented as part of the Charity Fraud Awareness Week. My name's Aaron Chauhan. I'm a trustee and director of the Fraud Advisory Panel, I'm also a solicitor that specialises in fraud and financial crime compliance, and have a particular interest in housing associations and the work from those types of organisations. Charity Fraud Awareness Week brings together everyone involved in the charity and not-for-profit sectors to raise awareness and share good practice in tackling fraud and financial crime. We encourage you to share this webinar and any of our other resources with your colleagues. Now, if you're joining us live, please, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar. Questions can be submitted at any time during the session through the Q&A box on screen, and we're going to deal with those at the end of the session. We'll strive to answer as many of those questions as we can as we move along. So why does tackling tenancy fraud matter? We have a growing population. The housing requirements for many are increasing, and there are many people in need who deserve to be in housing where it's available. The problem is all our housing stock is not available as it should be, and there's no room for abuse of the system. We're losing significant amounts of housing stock through fraud. It's funding fraudulent lifestyles at the expense of others. And this needs to be stopped. Deterrents need to be put in place and better governance needs to come about. And part of that is understanding the cost of tenancy fraud, which is a matter our panelists will speak about shortly. I see a range of fraud in a variety of sectors, but in particular with housing associations. Often I'm dealing with supplier and employee fraud, but even relating to properties, I'm seeing cases which are really concerning. At the moment, I'm dealing with a case on right to buy. Apparently the 94-year-old who's interested in now acquiring a property, whether that's in her interest or not. Her family are behind trying to push for this sale, and there's all kinds of issues about safeguarding, source of funds and identity. The critical thing is property is of real value. It's a value to fraudsters on their own. It's a value to organised crime gangs, and we need to do more to tackle it. So how do we tackle it? Well, I'm grateful that we've got a really strong panel of experts in this field here today. The running order will be starting with Steph Toghill, a housing investigations manager at Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. Steph's going to be followed by Alan Bryce, who's the non-executive director of the Tenancy Fraud Forum. We're then going to be followed by Ben Uckart, who is the assistant principal officer of Northern Ireland Housing Executive. We then have also with us Nicola Evans, who is the tenancy fraud manager at L&Q Housing Association. And then Steph is going to round up again at the end before I host the Q&A. So you've heard enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Steph and to start the session with hearing from our experts. Thank you, Steph.
Gonna have fun with the mute button now, aren't I? Right, okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for introducing. Just checking everyone can hear me, can't you? Give me a nod, yeah? Okay, I've got several buttons coming up. Right, okay, so I've got 5 minutes to talk to you about tenancy fraud and the history of tenancy fraud and why we are where we are right now. So this is going to be a whistle-stop tour. First off, so from my experience, when it comes to tenancy fraud comes in many different guises. We have non-occupation, so when someone's not occupying the property as their main and principal home. We're talking about social housing here. Abandonment, so people have literally just left the property and failed to give it back to the local authority or to the social housing provider, to the registered provider. You've got false housing applications, false accession applications, false assignment applications. There's cases of key selling as well that I'm aware of, where people have literally sold on their keys to a complete unknown person and allowed them to move into the property pretending to be the tenant themselves. And of course, the biggie that everyone really talks about is the illegal subletting. So when a social housing tenant decides to rent out their property for profit and allows another family to move in and they then move on somewhere else. First off, actually, if I can just explain, because obviously I don't know exactly who's on the in the audience here. So with this work, we cover both local authorities, so you have the general councils, and also other social housing providers. So you'll have the housing associations, the registered providers, and I think there's several different names that people say. So lots of people use PRPs or RPs or HAs to describe those registered providers. So you may hear those acronyms being used quite a lot, and I hope that kind of clarifies that up a little bit for you. But this work that we're doing here covers all social housing providers. So hopefully that's quite clear for you. But back to the history of tenancy fraud. So more often than not, originally this was dealt with as a housing management issue. It was never really a huge priority. There were no resources really put into it. There was no kind of investigative training put into it. That, you know, corporate fraud teams weren't really looking at it. It was a housing management issue. And as far as housing management is concerned, and I've heard this several times, and I know there are other panelists here who've heard exactly the same arguments that I have. Well, the rents are being paid, so really, is it a high priority? Particularly in housing management, where it's such a fast-paced environment and you're constantly having to respond to each crisis as it happens. So, you know, tenancy fraud very much took a back seat. But then, excitingly, just over 10 years ago, the Audit Commission produced these Protecting the Public Purse reports, which Alan Bryce, who is also on our panel, wrote a lot of the work, wrote a lot of the Protecting the Public Purse reports, and he carried out a lot of research himself on tenancy fraud, and he really helped to raise the profile of tenancy fraud. These reports helped to establish a link between the cost of temporary accommodation and tenancy fraud. So obviously for every property that we were able to recover through tenancy fraud was a cost of a temporary accommodation unit back. So suddenly there was a financial incentive as well as the moral incentive that it was a wrong thing to do for housing providers to suddenly stand up and take note that actually this was a serious issue, we needed to look at it. It helped us to create business cases, it helped us to make put more resources into training, investigators were standing up and taking note, corporate fraud teams were suddenly taking it on board as well. And I think over a period of about 4 years with these Protecting the Public Purse reports, the recoveries of the tenancy fraud, the recoveries of properties that were recovered, it was fivefold recovered, there were 5 times as more, particularly outside of London. So with all these business cases that were being made, there was a little bit of funding given out, there was legislation changes, it was all a very exciting period in tenancy fraud. However, there was never a real definitive answer on what the true cost of tenancy fraud was. There was no real thought given to multipliers. How long does a tenancy fraud last for? There was real issues when it came to housing associations who don't carry a temporary accommodation bill. They don't have that cost themselves. So this basically meant that lots of people, lots of housing providers were using lots of different ways to formulate and to put a financial argument together for their costings. There's no real consistency, and so basically the Tenancy Fraud Forum, we decided that it was time to try and come up with an actual figure of what the true cost of tenancy fraud is. We put a lot of work into it, we did a lot of research, and we've come up with something that we are incredibly happy with. We've got support from various different organisations, so LBFIG, so it's the Tenancy Fraud Forum, you've got LBFIG on board with us, the National Fraud Initiative, obviously the Fraud Advisory Panel, CIFAS, CITFA, G15, CIH. So we've now produced this, we've carried out lots of research, and I think this is probably the time where I hand over to you, Alan, so you can talk exactly about that research and a little bit more about the formula.
Thanks, Steph, and good morning, everyone. So my name's Alan Bryce. I'm here in my capacity as a non-executive director for the Tenancy Fraud Forum. And as you heard there, I was formerly head of counter fraud at the Audit Commission, where I first researched the issue of tenancy fraud itself. And I'm also formerly head of counter fraud at the and cybercrime at the Charity Commission. So I've done a great deal of work around the different regulators that the people on this call might be involved with. So in my part of the webinar, I'm going to cover, if you like, the help sheet that is now available on the website, and we'd encourage you to have a look at that, download it and distribute it, and also in particular the formula within that. I'm going to talk about the evidence base on which we have created the help sheet and that formula, and say why your organization, whether you're a council or a PRP, why you should use it. And at the end, I'm going to also say, in effect, what is the magic number? What is the value that we recommend your organization adopt as a value of a detected tenancy fraud? So you just heard from Steph about the background to housing tenancy fraud and making the case about why we need a universally agreed and prudent way of calculating that tenancy fraud. Steph mentioned moments ago the organizations that we've partnered with this year in terms of looking to create this updated approach. And so those organizations, we came together and we set ourselves the objectives, the criteria that you see on the screen right now. So what we looked to do was to create a formula and approach that was flexible. By that, I mean, it would be able to create a national average value for the cost of a tenancy fraud that we could all agree upon, but was flexible enough to allow local tailoring. And one of the issues that has consistently been raised over the years by councils is that there are elements of the different ways in which tenancy fraud is calculated that don't always reflect the direct cost to those individual councils and their local circumstances. So we wanted to create or have a formula that that would allow that flexibility if it was required and if some councils wanted to do so. It would have to be prudent. And by that, I mean, it would, if anything, understate rather than overstate the cost. We're more likely to get sector-wide agreement and use of this approach that we're advocating if we err on the prudent side and, if anything, slightly understate what the cost would be. Always better to understate than overstate in terms of the credibility of the approach that we're advocating. It does, however, have to reflect the true costs. What are those costs that we could all agree on as those different key stakeholder organizations are partnering with us on this? What are those costs that we all can agree on that should be included? And should there be a multi-year aspect to this? You know, what is the average length of a tenancy fraud? It also has to be applicable to both those PRPs, those housing associations that Steph referred to at the start, and to councils. It has to be applicable and usable by both. And it has to be evidence-based, not just the elements of personal judgment, but some real hard evidence around what actually the figure should be. So with these criteria in mind, we had an initial look across the sector and identified a whole variety of approaches and a whole variety of cost multipliers that councils and housing associations, or PRPs, are using. Many organizations use that association between temporary accommodation costs and tenancy fraud. A number of organizations had multi-year and different multi-year multipliers put in there. Some organizations also use the replacement cost, £150,000 replacement cost for a property as a multiplier. None of these are wrong. None of these could all be justified in their different ways and in different circumstances. But they did end up giving us some markedly different final valuations. So you can see why we really needed to undertake this research. Now, one approach when we looked across the sector stood out for us, that by the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, and you're going to hear from Ben shortly about their approach and how they've come to that basis. But the formula that the Northern Ireland Housing Executive created, our working group quickly concluded that, with some minor tweaking, and that's what I'm going to talk about in a moment, that the approach that was created there in that formula was something that met our criteria. So can I have the next slide, please? So this is the formula itself. And again, it's all available on the help sheet, and we encourage you to take this to your organization and to adopt it. Now, what you see on your screen, I will go through it in each section in a bit more detail and explain where we've derived these figures from. But what you see on your screen now is the categories that we recommend within the formula. And on the right-hand side is the national average that we've calculated for England. And that'll give us our national figure that we would recommend organizations to use. But for certain elements, in terms of the local tailoring, I'll explain where, if you're a council, if you want, where and why you might want to change certain elements, just to give you more of a locally tailored, more cashable figure, if you think that's appropriate. So where do we start? Well, the annual average temporary accommodation cost per family. Now, this figure here, which we've calculated as £12,100 as the national average for England, we derived that from information in the House of Commons library that was published last year, and it's based on the position as at the end of March 2020. And we deliberately done so to avoid any issues around the impact of COVID lockdown, for example. So that's the annual average figure. But we do appreciate that, of course, that figure will vary for different councils across the country. And of course, they may wish to put their own figure in, but that's the average national. Again, just for councils, we also recognise that councils will get housing benefit that is associated with that temporary accommodation cost. And many councils have looked for a degree of flexibility where they can offset the temporary accommodation, they can offset the housing benefit that they receive in relation to that temporary accommodation cost to find out what their cashable figure is here. So in our formula, if you wish to, as a council only, you can put your figure, that data in there. And I know some organisations do attempt to do that. And again, it's entirely up to yourselves if you're a council. But of course, to calculate the national average, that doesn't apply. Housing benefit is in effect paid for by all of us through taxation. So we don't offset that to calculate the national average. So we have £12,100, and then we multiply it by 3 to give us 36,300. Why do we multiply that by 3? Well, that's what our research found to be the average length of a tenancy fraud. Let me explain where we come from to derive that figure. So we asked any council or PRP to provide information to us on the average length of a tenancy fraud multiplier that they have used themselves in their own circumstances. And 6 London and non-London housing providers provided us information based on over 400 individual cases spanning a 10-year period. And that found an average of 3.5 years as the average length of a tenancy fraud. But we also want to give opportunity for other providers who haven't necessarily done that calculation, and particularly for more recent information around the average length of a tenancy fraud. So we did make available the facility for any housing provider, again, council or PRP, to provide information on individual cases, at least 10, and ideally more recent cases, from which we could then calculate the average. And that average, we found exactly, we had 7 providers provide information on exactly 100 cases, and that gives an average of 3.2 years. So if we triangulate that, we have between 3.5 and 3.2 years. Those 2 different research streams found the average length of a tenancy fraud to be. And therefore, again, erring on the prudent side, if anything, to slightly underestimate the figure, that we've accepted 3 years as being the multiplier, and therefore why we've multiplied by 3. And then you can add in the average one-off costs. And in this particular case, the investigation costs £1,300, legal costs £1,000, and void costs of £3,140. Now, we've derived all of that from the research that Northern Ireland Housing Executive did themselves on their own individual cases. I would fully accept that for many councils, particularly in London, South East, and many of the other cities, some of those costs might be locally much higher, but not greatly out of range for most. Therefore, for our national average, we've included those figures, but again, individual councils and individual circumstances may want to add in their own individual figures should they want to tailor the formula to their own individual position. That gives us £41,740 as the total figure, which we've approximated to £42,000. That's the cost to the national taxpayer. That's the magic number of the value of a tenancy fraud that we recommend that all housing providers should use. We do, however, recognise that for PRPs, of course, temporary accommodation costs do not apply. And that's why we've, again, argued and adopted within the help sheet the argument, I think we'd probably, all of us on this call would agree, that PRPs and councils both have a moral responsibility, we'll call it their public duty, to take action. And in terms of valuing a tenancy fraud, we think that £42,000 reflects the true cost of to the taxpayer and should be the value that PRPs adopt. However, we do also recognise that that's not necessarily an easily viewed issue within PRPs. And that's why we've also identified within the help sheet that there's a governance responsibility, by which I mean PRPs are stewards of housing assets, and the book value of individual housing units for a PRP in England, the average value of the book value is £37,000 per property, and that's the value of an asset that has temporarily been lost control of by the PRP because of a tenancy fraud. And we believe that's a governance responsibility and something that PRPs should take on board. Next slide, please. All housing providers should adopt 42,000 as the cost of the tenancy fraud. councils can tailor that formula if you want, and that for PRPs, we think you've got the 42,000 public duty value that you should take into account when valuing tenancy fraud, but also take into account the governance value, the temporary loss of control of an asset, which the book value, the understated value, if you like, rather than the market value, is £37,000. So please have a look at all that information. It's all in the help sheet. There's also a blog that we now have that goes with this particular part of International Charity Fraud Awareness Week. And we recommend that you take those on board and champion it at your own organisation. Thank you. And over to you, Ben.
So I'd just like to start by giving thanks to the organisers for providing me with the opportunity to speak at this event, and to my fellow panelists for all their hard work on the new fraud calculation methodology. As Alan mentioned, my NIHE colleagues and I recently adopted a loss formula similar to that being launched today, and I've been asked to talk a bit about the NIHE experience in using it. So I'll try to give you just a bit of an explanation on how we came to develop the formula, our rationale for doing so, and how we feel it benefits us as an organisation. I'd like to start just by providing some context for those who are unfamiliar with us and what we do. The NIHE, or Housing Executive, was established in 1971 and is Northern Ireland's single comprehensive regional housing authority. We're the largest social housing landlord in Northern Ireland, not the UK, with approximately 85,000 properties across the entire province, ranging from city high-rise flats to rural cottages. As well as being a housing provider, we administer the common waiting list for social housing and are the sole body with the statutory authority to assess homelessness in Northern Ireland. So in effect, we manage the entirety of the housing cycle for our customers, from application to allocation and finally determination. In light of our dual function as landlord and regional authority, we're under an imperative to ensure our stock is not misappropriated through tenancy fraud, and to understand the financial implications of failing to act on it where it does occur. Social housing is a scarce resource in Northern Ireland as it is in the rest of the UK. And with a current figure of approximately 45,000 applicants on our housing waiting list, it's essential that social housing is allocated to those in the highest need and used only by those entitled to do so. Fairness is a core value of our organisation, and equitable allocation of housing stock was one of its founding aims. There are substantial costs incurred by tenancy fraud, societal to the organisation and to the public purse, but we were perhaps not always aware of the actual scale and costs of the problem as we might have been. Indeed, the roots of our decision to develop our own fraud loss methodology go right back to the launch of our first tenancy fraud strategy in 2013. Stephanie mentioned this as well. Much of our effort in addressing tenancy fraud prior to that point had been fairly reactive, directed towards recovering abandoned properties rather than identifying and investigating other types of property fraud, such as subletting, that are perhaps more lucrative and therefore more common in other areas of mainland Britain. We previously tended to view abandonment as a tenancy management function primarily, rather than as fraud involving a public asset with real financial implications. At that time, we were not alone in holding this view in the Northern Ireland social sector. A Northern Ireland Audit Office report from 2013 and a follow-up report in 2014 from the Public Accounts Committee in Stormont both expressed concern at the generally slow response of all of Northern Ireland's social housing providers to the increased risk of tenancy fraud, which had previously been identified in Great Britain. Both bodies made a number of recommendations to the sector on how to record, report, and tackle tenancy fraud, as well as citing concerns about the lack of data around an actual baseline for tenancy fraud in Northern Ireland. It was this early lack of an evidence-based figure that resulted in us having to make some initial assumptions around the scale and cost of tenancy fraud, say which were based on research undertaken elsewhere in the UK, and were not wholly reflective of the true picture in Northern Ireland. Nevertheless, in the absence of anything more tailored to our situation, we were obliged to adopt these figures. And as you might imagine, coupling inflated indicative fraud rates with inflated estimated costs painted a potentially worrying picture for us as a landlord. However, these fraud estimates, while slightly elevated, did have the unintended consequence of creating the sense of urgency that allowed us to roll out the recommendations made by the Public Accounts Committee and Audit Office in 2013 and 14. I don't propose to go through all of these, as many of them will be already familiar to you from best practice guidelines. However, I would cite two key improvements which brought our organisation a much deeper understanding of the fraud situation in Northern Ireland. One was the creation of a specialist Tenancy Fraud Investigation Unit within the NIHE to investigate more complex cases of tenancy fraud. The other was the development of more robust data collection methods to allow us to monitor and report on our fraud performance to the Department for Communities, the NIHE board, and our various internal assurance teams. Despite these improvements, it wasn't until 2019 that we finally felt we were in a position to review the fraud loss figure that we've been using up to that point. As we said, we felt the existing one didn't reflect the reality of the situation in Northern Ireland, which is a very different cost to much of the mainland UK, and we felt it would be very difficult to stand over. So in doing the review, our guiding principle was not just to create another arbitrary figure, taken at a point in time, but rather to create a repeatable, justifiable formula that could be rerun in the future and validated by the necessary oversight body. I won't go into the specifics of our individual formula, but suffice to say it was constructed in a similar way to today's new fraud valuation method, using evidence-based figures for the direct and ancillary costs of fraud to our organisation. To move on to the benefits of using this formula, first and foremost is the reliability and accuracy of the fraud loss figure it produces. There can often be a lack of understanding in housing organisations as to the reality of the financial impact of tenancy fraud, as was the case in the Housing Executive. In cases such as subletting, where a fraudster uses a social asset for his own personal gain, the scale of the loss is clear. However, abandonment and non-occupation, again sometimes overlooked as housing management issues, also incur a financial cost to the public purse, again which can be overlooked. Being able to quantify this loss with an evidence-based formula has proven invaluable to us in raising awareness among staff, stakeholders, and the wider public as to the reality of tenancy fraud and the need to tackle it whenever it occurs. Clearly setting out how the figure has been reached provides transparency and will help us to explain the rationale should there be any challenges to the method. A second benefit of the formula, and Alan mentioned this, is the flexibility. We can modify its component figures as necessary to reflect the changing cost of tenancy fraud while still maintaining a consistency for the purposes of comparison. One example already mentioned is how you can make a distinction between cost to the provider or the council and the larger cost to the public purse by adding or removing the cost of housing related benefits. It can also be used to reflect fraud cost variation within our own organisation. As an example, the specific demography of individual areas could mean that more homeless families or vulnerable individuals are denied housing, resulting in a corresponding increase in temporary accommodation and support costs. Alternatively, any increase in re-let repair costs can be reflected with a minor recalculation. So in conclusion, it's our experience that using a clearly defined agreed formula will provide a reliable, accurate fraud loss figure for your organisation, and it would also ensure there is consistency in approach to facilitate comparisons within your organisation and across the wider sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. That was really helpful. Nicola, over to you.
Good morning, all. Thank you for having me here today. I'm going to come at things from a slightly different angle, given that my experience within the tenancy fraud field has involved me working as an investigator for both local authority and housing associations, investigating tenancy fraud over more years than I care to mention. I have to say, when I first saw this help sheet, it was a welcome emergence of information, because when working for a housing association, tackling this issue, it has always been a moral obligation. It has always been, if it's thought that it's worth looking at, then we'll look at it. But as has previously been mentioned, if the rent's being paid, then everything, why upset the apple cart kind of thing. So with this new formula that's come about, and the fact that housing associations, PRPs, have been acknowledged in this and have got figures that they can bring to the table, is a fabulous thing. More recently, I've been appointed as the manager of a new tenancy fraud team within L&Q. This has happened within the last 3 months or so, very early days. But the emergence of this form, I popped it under my boss's nose the other day just to have a look at, just shows in very easy terms the actual implication to a housing association or PRP of actually not being accountable for dealing with this kind of issue. For so long, it has been a housing management issue. And as we all know, housing officers housing management staff, they have so many different hats to wear, that it's an impossible ask for them to look into tenancy fraud matters in the way they need to. The use of trained, qualified investigators to look into this area of work is invaluable, and I am grateful to L&Q for having the foresight to think that it's actually worth investing in this activity to actually deal with tenancy fraud and actually give it a dedicated resource to do so. We're only going to be successful in this by working in partnership with our local authority housing fraud partners, team partners, and again, this help sheet identifies the use of working collaboratively, excuse my words, I can't get my words out today, collaboratively on this. I've made contact with several local authority partners already, and the consensus is that having a specialised team in-house in the housing associations or PRPs is welcome to them, because, and from my own experience as well, LAs and HAs, PRPs, there's certain frustrations at not being able to get information to move cases forward, whichever side you're working on. If you're working in partnership, this information is wholly available, and then the best way to carry a case forward can be decided in partnership. And there are so many different ways that these matters can be dealt with: civilly, criminally, unlawful profit orders, and so on. So when, in my experience, I found that housing associations and PRPs take the view that as long as the rent is being paid, then there's not really an issue to tackle. This help sheet, this formula, puts numbers in front of them. And we all know that sometimes figures speak louder than words. The fact that there has been identified a book value, that there is a governance matter around this, that has to speak volumes to those decision makers in housing associations and PRPs on whether or not this is something that really does need to be looked into. It's a great piece of information. It's a fabulous piece of work to take forward to those, make a business case to take forward, to actually get specialist services involved in dealing with this on behalf of, if not by, PRPs and housing associations. At the heart of all we do are our residents, and we know that tenancy fraud isn't just about dealing with the matter itself. Tenancy fraud has massive knock-on impacts to the environment our residents live in, the safety of the residents live in, huge disrepair issues because people can't report repairs getting done, and because they're not actually the rightful tenant living in properties. There's so many knock-on effects to tenancy fraud that if more people were on board with dealing with it, if more PRPs were on board with embracing the idea that we can effectively deal with this, and there's a real value to it, if that is the basis of looking at it, then this help sheet will then quantify the need to do that, and it gives those in-house, and maybe some that work in housing management, a point to start from to create that business case. I could talk forever on tenancy fraud. I do to anybody that listens, but the frustration for me has always been that there hasn't been anything really readily available to make it relevant to housing associations and PRPs, and I think that this does that. I think it does that immeasurably, and I think that the if you work for a housing association, if you work in housing management, if you appreciate that the actual way of dealing with tenancy fraud is a monumental task, there's a reason that there are specialist investigators that deal with tenancy fraud, and it's because the time and expertise needed to investigate and carry this forward fully, it's a specialist area. It does take time, it does take knowledge, it does take experience, that it's an impossible task for housing management staff to deal with that effectively. So if it's a case of housing providers not having the tools in-house to deal with this, take this formula, take this help sheet, put it under the noses of people that make the decisions within your organisation to deal with this effectively. I know full well in-house within L&Q, this will be something that will quantify the work that we do as a team, and it will be used, the figures involved will be used to actually highlight the benefit of having us in-house, and also working collaboratively with our local authority partners. And I know that like I've said previously, numbers speak louder than words, and this is exactly what this figure and these figures have been brought about to, you know, make very apparent to those that need to know. I think that's all I'm going to say on it for now. So I'm going to pass over to Steph to carry the baton on.
Hey, am I muted? Yeah, sorry, I have such problems with these things. Right, so I wanted to talk about the formula from a local authority perspective. So I'm heading up the housing investigations team for the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. So again, very much similar to Nicola, actually. It's a brand new team that's being set up. They've been tackling tenancy fraud as part of the corporate anti-fraud service up until, well, they're continuing to do so now as well, but we've come up and hopefully we'll be able to recover even more properties. So that would be great. But I am very excited about this formula. I'm really excited about the new true value, well, the value cost that we've come to, the 42,000K is a national average, I think is a very fair average. I am particularly happy that it's been well researched, that the research and evidence is clear, that so if there are any questions around it, it's all clear, it's all there to be seen in, I don't know, in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years time, we can still see exactly how we came to that figure. That information isn't going to get lost in the ether and wondering where these figures came from previously. It's all very clearly set out. So if we do need to change it, if the average temporary accommodation cost does change going forward, as I'm sure it will eventually, again, all we need to do is just slip the new cost in there. It's in the formula itself is sound, and we can change the bits as we change as we go along in the future. So should temporary accommodation costs go up, for example, or go down? Should our legal costs go up or go down? I doubt very much they'll go down. They never seem to go down. But you take my point. The other thing that I am particularly happy with it was a real thing for me, is making sure that whatever we came up with was relevant. So, I mean, Nicola's already mentioned about it being relevant to housing associations. Ben already mentioned about the previous figures not being relevant to the Northern Ireland exec. So I think this has been really achieved with this particular formula, and the flexibility that allows local authorities to, and housing associations, to input their own figures. So we can put in our own temporary accommodation costs. Where I am, our temporary accommodation costs are far higher than the average that are on there at the moment. So we're able to adapt that and put in our own costs. We also know that our investigation costs are also higher than the national average, so we would put in our own investigation costs. We know that our void costs are higher, so we put in our own void costs. So the flexibility there, so where local authorities, housing associations have had difficulties with making sure that the figures that they're trying to put forward are relevant, we can evidence base it. It's all there, it's all broken down, and if ours are higher, then put your higher ones in. It's not a problem. What I'm planning on doing is using these figures, using this formula in court cases. I know I saw a question earlier about whether or not we could use these as court. Absolutely, I'm intending to. When I go for criminal and for civil court, I'll be putting these down as part of our costs, and I will be able to establish exactly where those costs have come from. Even if my costs are different, I can say this is the formula. These are why RBK&C's costs, for example, are higher. So these are our average temporary accommodation costs. These are our average void costs. And I will be able to evidence all of that and explain why ours are slightly different from the accepted national formula. So yeah, for me, this is really exciting. I'm hoping to use this both in court to recover costs. I'm hoping to use this in business cases to help raise the profile of tenancy fraud, to encourage more resources into my team and across RBK&C in general when it comes to tackling tenancy fraud, to raise the profile, as I just said, about tackling tenancy fraud. I'm also hoping to use this when it comes to publicity, both internally around the organisation, to help raise people's interest and understanding of tenancy fraud and the stakes and the costs that are attributed to it. So if, for example, the caretakers are out on estates and they see something going on that isn't quite right, they know to come and report it. They know it's an important issue, and they know that we will take action on it, and that we want to know something will be done about it. And I also am hoping to use this as part of our publicity for our residents as well, to raise the profile with them, to raise the understanding that actually tenancy fraud does cost. It is not a victimless crime. There is moral obligation, of course, the victims being the people on our waiting list, the victims being the people in our temporary accommodation who are going without homes unnecessarily. So obviously the more properties we can get back, the more people we can help, the more people we can house adequately. And then the more reports we get, the more putting it back, and we can, yeah, it just helps to kind of cement that we do take it seriously, that we do need that information. We need the residents to come forward and say, yes, this is wrong, and I'm going to tell you the information that I've got. And not only is it moral, but also because it protects, you know, the HRA for the local authorities. It's part of our housing revenue accounts. It helps us to go on and provide additional services. It helps to keep social services running, or sorry, no, not social services, it's within housing, but it helps to keep like the housing services running, and it helps to reduce the cuts that are going on as well. So it, as Nicola said as well, it all has a massive snowball effect. Everything is interlinked. And I'm really hoping that being able to have a real solid formula, evidence-based piece of work that we can use to demonstrate to the courts, to our bosses, to our councillors, to our residents, to all the organisations and all the internal departments as well within our local authorities and our housing association partners, to get them on board to work with us too. Yeah, I'm all over this, and I'm really happy about it. And I've had lots of positive feedback, so basically saying similar. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Steph, for rounding up at the end. It's obviously really positive, and I know one of the problems I face day to day, be it with private sector clients or with not-for-profits, is demonstrating why it's important to prevent fraud. And usually it's, well, where's my return on investment? Where can I demonstrate that I've made a saving by stopping fraud? And it's an impossibility. So this is brilliant for this area. Well, look, we are just about on time. So firstly, may I thank all the panelists, Ben, Alan, Nicola and Steph. You've all been really insightful and helpful. I'm sure everyone who's attended has taken a lot of value out of today. There is a survey at the end of this webinar. We'd be grateful if anyone who's on as a participant will take a few minutes to complete that. It's really useful for us just to make sure that we're doing this well for everyone. This webinar will be available on demand. From me, thank you very much for everybody attending, the participants and our experts today, and we hope this has been of use, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much. Bye.